Well, hello, everyone. I'm Erica Lukes, your host of Expanding Frontiers, and you can find us at expandingfrontiersresearch.org to check out the work that Jack and I do. Jack is always researching something, doing records requests, and he is putting a lot of time into our project. We were talking the other day on the phone and saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe it's been 3 years since we started this endeavor. It feels like time just goes by so quickly, but I'm incredibly proud of all that we've accomplished. So thank you, Jack, for your wonderful work. And I also want to just give a shout out to everybody in the audience today. I know we're a little bit of a different time, so thank you for rolling with us. I want to say hi to Amy and to Jim. Jim, I know that you are in a completely different side of the world, and so we appreciate you accommodating our schedule and being here. We've missed seeing you. So on that note, I want to introduce our guest who has been on the show just actually 7 months ago, and it was a wonderful conversation. I was re-listening to it today, and lots of really good tidbits in there. So go back and listen to our interview. Today, we are joined by Dr. Jeb Card, who is an associate teaching professor in anthropology at Miami University. He earned a Ph.D. in anthropology from Tulane University. Dr. Card's area of research, scholarship, and professional activities include the role of antiquity in modern esoteric, paranormal, and conspiracy belief communities. So we obviously know we're going to have a great conversation today. As recently covered at the conversation, Dr. Card teaches a course titled Investigating the Paranormal. The curriculum reflects his interest in the paranormal concepts and his study of the UFO community conducted for his doctoral research in cultural anthropology. In addition to field and lab work, Dr. Card examines the nature and development of archaeology in regards to other popular and influential conceptions. I can speak English, of antiquity. This includes archival research, media analysis, and the examination of how antiquity is the foundational factor of paranormal belief systems. Previous work on this topic includes his book, Spooky Archaeology, Myth and Science of the Past, as well as the culture and its historical emergence of a paranormal unified field theory, strongly tied to considerations of antiquity. That is so impressive. I had to stumble once. Welcome to the show.
Hello. Yeah, no, the conversation thing. Yeah, I'm an archaeologist. That's been a lot of my background, but I've also been writing a bit on that. And am I the reason you're on a different time?
You know what? We've been kind of switching it up a little bit lately.
We will admit that, yes, sir.
We did.
Okay, so when are you normally?
You know what? We do Friday nights at 5 o'clock Mountain Standard Time.
Oh,
but we've been, we've been, because we're interviewing people that have time restraints and things. And so Jack has been doing shorter interviews. He just started a new series that's really great. And then whenever we can get people, we're doing it. And sometimes we do them live and sometimes we do pre-recorded. And we're just happy to have you here. So
cool. All right. Well, thank you for having on. So what do we want to talk about? I mean, any number of potential things.
You know what? There are. Jack, go ahead. Sorry.
Sure, there are a number of things to talk about. For one, whatever you've been working on and what your sites have been on since we talked to you last is welcome. But I was also interested in your class, your Investigating the Paranormal class, what it covers, the things that I'm sure you get a variety of feedback from students, staff, public about it. Tell us all about your course.
Sure, yeah. It is now Anthropology 113, Investigating the Paranormal. I don't think they would have let me have 13 or 1313, just the way the numbers work. Excuse me. But it is an introductory level anthropology course, and while a lot of majors definitely are going to take it, it is in our, there's different terms for it. I don't want to get into ours, but basically it's one of those that serves certain requirements that you have to do for for your degree. And one of them is something called signature inquiry. This is a whole new thing. new system, and that is, are you going into some kind of deep topic? Are you, or not deep topic, doing some kind of investigation, some kind of larger project, not just, oh, here, I'm going to take some tests and, stuff like that. And the class actually worked really well for that. That was actually one of the things that made it easy to set through our curriculum thing, because it's a history and a examination of the paranormal as a cultural idea, or not as a cultural idea, as a concept and as a cultural phenomenon. It is also, though, looking at it from a social perspective in some specifics. So we're in Ohio, and we are not exactly, but we're kind of in the general area, getting into, like, if you go into southeastern Ohio into Appalachia. And of course, that region has become this whole, the weird Appalachia thing. Now, I don't mean that in a negative way. It's a self-created term, or a, it's like keep Austin weird. It's sort of that thing. And of course, obviously, one of the core things to that is the Mothman Festival, which I finally went to last fall. I'm actually going to be speaking, I'm not quite ready, at the Loveland Frogman Festival conference in, like, Sunday.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I'm going to be talking about how and this kind of is sort of what the course begins to get to. It's going to be about how ideas about that and how it's been framed and interpreted sort of can mirror different ways the paranormal has been a cultural phenomenon since, like, the 1940s, 50s. Obviously an older one, but it's tied to that. But no, for their signature inquiry, I actually have them take a number of, I don't know if I'm going to continue having them read the Mothman Prophecies, the book. I think maybe I can just teach some of its ideas for them. But even though there's a lot in there, but there's books like The Blank Blank of West Virginia, or The Monsters of so-and-so area. And so, like, I have them read like 3 or 4 of those, but I don't mean read. I have them, like, tear them apart, not in a critical sense, like, oh, here's this story. What's being reported here? What's being reported here? What is, when people say, oh, there is a paranormal sort of Appalachia, what do they mean? Like, what do they mean in terms of, if it was other parts of the world, if it was, I don't know, Utah, it might be like, oh, are people talking about certain kinds of things on a ranch, or those sorts of things. But in the class itself, so they do that as a major project. There's, like, multiple stages, like, oh, learn how to go take data, learn how to sort of analyze this. But throughout it is a general look at one of the big things is the ologies and the development of them. So cryptozoology, cryptozoology, ufology, parapsychology, and how those are not just a thing. Like, those only really start to emerge in some ways at certain historical times that are associated with changes in science. So, like, do you get ufology before you get Charles Fort, and do you get it before big science in the middle of the 20th century, post-bomb, post-1947 National Security Act? That does not talk about what people are seeing in the sky, but as a social thing. And do you even have it now? Do you have a something like that now, or has it become something else?
That's
So,
fascinating.
yeah. So we start. I start with the old past. I start with, what are the first ghosts? I talk about some of the research of people like Irving Finkel, and we talk about how this ties into the development of notions of science, and then it really starts getting going with things like spiritualism and the psychical researchers, the SPR, and then I start taking them through these ideas, like, okay, the idea that there are other creatures on the planet, and the notion of extinction, and then survival. So basically taking them through each of the big fields and how they're a lot more similar than people might think, and how they have then in practice started to be treated as the same thing. And of course, that gets us into topics I know you all know, and I warn them every day. Every lecture will be weirder. And if this helps you understand what I mean, that by the end, I'm openly having them, like I'm showing them in class, documents from Stargate. And I'm like, here is a whole bunch of people tied to Robert Bigelow and Andrea Puharich and Hal Puthoff, and how these different things get tied together. And I guess if this gives you the vibe, the two words, I mean, there's several, theosophy shows up a lot, but the few words that keep showing up again and again are poltergeist, fairies, theosophy, and there's probably one more, but those are and then the other one, they're like, so guess who was involved at this point? And they're like, oh no, is he going to say John Keel? I'm like, I'm going to say John Keel. Yes. So that's kind of the vibe. It is this sort of the way things have become kind of entangled, but they always frankly have been. When I say the ologies, I actually feel that's kind of a cultural bubble that mirrored the social capital of science, and when it rose and fell, and you get those people sticking an ology on something when in reality that's not necessarily what they're doing, and they're not just trying to be this little science or that. There's some broader kind of esoteric thing going on. So that's kind of the class.
Wow, I wish I could attend that class or hear you lecture this weekend. That sounds fascinating. Can you talk a little bit more about the paranormal realm and the spiritualism and the things that were evolving in history or taking place at that time?
Well, yeah. So one of the big things, and I'd be curious to hear what you all think about this. I mean, I don't think you can talk about, and again, there is both, what do people experience? But here I'm talking about as a cultural perspective, how people engage with it, because it's a social phenomenon, regardless of what else is going on. It has to be discussed with the development. I mean, how many times have we had somebody who's talking about this paranormal perspective or this, and ultimately we are more than the material. We are more than materialism. I mean, what's Bigelow's other thing? It's like, oh, I'm interested in this ranch also, and UFOs, also consciousness after death. Did y'all know Tom Slick? You know who that is, right?
No.
Okay. Jack,
I
look
do
like
not.
Tom Slick is the guy who basically funded, he was a Texas oil man. Tell me if you've heard this story. He was a Texas oil man, became, well, you'll see why I say it, fascinated with adventures and stuff like that, but with the Yeti as it was just beginning to emerge, and then Bigfoot just as being emerged, middle of the 20th century, the 1950s and early 1960s. He dies in a plane crash in the early 60s. He basically funds the entire emergence of all of that.
Okay.
He pays for people to go, like real scientists as well as more interesting characters. Also, he's tied into the intelligence community. He's the one who has people like Peter Byrne, not David Byrne. I always make that confusion with the musician, but Peter Byrne, the relatively recently passed cryptozoology guy, he's the one who helps facilitate him taking a finger from the Pangbosh hand. Do you all know this one?
Yes, because I'm sorry, now you're coming back because you talked about this last time.
Yeah.
My recollection.
He's the one who got that out of there. And he did all this Yeti stuff, all of that. He also founded a institute for the study of consciousness. So he's a millionaire who
How'd I miss this?
Yeah, he's a million. So Tom Slick, they actually just did a semi-drama podcast with him, or not with him, about him. Or dramatic. I haven't heard it yet, but no, he's a millionaire. Gets really interested in this stuff. Hires scientists to go look for monsters, and he does in North America, and also sets up an institute for like consciousness, which means both various elements of psychology, but also what you think of when you think of that term. So there's a reason I bring him up. But he's a good example of this sort of, we're really interested, like if you're interested in the one, this sort of reaction to the rise of materialism in a way that's associated with professional science. That's really the break point. I spent a lot of time talking about urbanization. I spent a lot of time talking about the fact that the word extinction, or the concept of extinction, doesn't really exist much before 1800, because then you start to get into things like evolution. Then you start to get into ideas of deep time. You have this huge shift. And I talk about how, yeah, people believe in spirits that aren't us. People believe in entities that are not us for, eons. I mentioned Irving Finkel's book on the first ghosts, where he's talking about the Sumerians. But it being the paranormal, the idea of studying it and having evidence and all of that, is inherently tied to the rise of science as a sort of Western concept, but also in confrontation with it. Because again, time after time, when you see people like, oh, I'm interested in how they built this pyramid, eventually, though, we're talking about instructions for the other side. Oh, I want to know about this haunted portal place, but also life after death. Like it inevitably comes in one form or another. And so that's where it starts. Like, the first paranormal organization, or at least one of them, is the SPR, the Society for Psychical Research, which starts as wanting to find the non-material skeptics. I don't mean they're trying to find the skeptics. They're like, oh, we want to find life of evidence after death or of psychic ability, but all these mediums can't be trusted. And of course, there's a lot of gender stuff going on there too. So they found in, I think it's 1892 in London, or maybe it's a little earlier. And then there's the ASPR in the US. That's the beginning of what we'll eventually call parapsychology. And there's a lot of scientists involved. So I look at a lot of that relationship too. So
let's go. Can we go back to Tom Slick for a moment and just
Sure.
talk about him? Because you're mentioning all the things that Jack and I are very intrigued with the intelligence community and some of these. He's moving back and forth and different things. So what involvement did he have in the
Well,
intelligence?
there's debate about that. So Loren Coleman was the guy who really started to push, very big into. He's always talked about, it's always a cryptozoologist. I'm like, have you read a lot of his earlier books? They're often a lot woollier. But where he talks about, the Fayetteville effect and the devil names thing and all of that's much more Fortean. But I want to say it's in the late 80s, he starts writing about Tom Slick, and he's the one who really starts to push this. Now, his Slick's, I believe it's his daughter or maybe granddaughter. I forget. I have her book somewhere. Also has written about him more recently. But there is debate about exactly how heavy he was in the community. But I mean, let me put it this way. He definitely knew CIA folks, which, I mean, if you're in the elite of America at that time, is not hard. But I mean, he ran a air cargo, air transport, etc. business in South Asia in the 1950s. So some have tried to argue that he's straight up like fully in with the CIA. Others have really pushed that. No, maybe he's not that much. We know there was CIA engagement in some of the Yeti hunting. We know that some of it was cover. Not like, oh, people don't want to do this, but they're like, also, where you are in the 1950s? Right next to China as they are absorbing Tibet and as they're building the bomb. Right next to it in the mountains. Just pointing that out. And so, yeah, there is that component. There is that component to it. I don't think that he's like, oh, I don't think he's doing it as a front end. He's clearly interested in it. I mean, I don't think there's any intelligence part that has him funding the first Bigfooters, which is what he does in the Pacific Northwest in California, et cetera. But in the Himalayan stuff, there is an overlap with the intelligence stuff, and how overlapped he specifically is debated.
Oh, fascinating. Okay.
and the air in Southeast Asia, like when I hear those kinds of things, like CIA officers on the NICAP board, things like that. I always think of, okay, if they weren't doing it in a professional capacity, they still needed to know how to navigate it.
Mhm.
Like you're not going to become the mayor of New York without knowing how to navigate all the different cultural aspects of it.
Yeah.
So whether you're a card carrying CIA officer or not, you've seen them around,
Oh yeah.
and you know how to interact with these people.
Yeah. And some of them, I mean, first off, if you were kind of like elite in certain kinds of professional things in that time period, the chances that you were initially in OSS, the Office of, was it Strategic Services, was the forerunner of the CIA, was extremely high. Was extremely high. One of the people that interacted with him on the Yeti stuff was Carlton Kuhn, who has a lot of stuff going on with him. Not all of it good, but he was OSS. He was a physical anthropologist, and he was involved in Yeti stuff. He wasn't one of the primaries, but others were in those various realms as well. And of course, he's also hobnobbing with celebrities. I mean, the guy who gets the finger bone out of India is Jimmy Stewart and his wife, like the Jimmy Stewart. I'm not going to do an impression because I couldn't. There's some I can. I can't do his, unless I practiced it a little. But no, you're absolutely right. There is that interaction, and of course, while there can be, oh, we're doing this or that in terms of using it as cover, also it's, I suspect, of an interest to those kinds of professionals. I mean, the early CIA, I mean, my advisor's father very openly was in the CIA after OSS as an archaeologist, but that's complicated. He was an archaeologist and then he joined the CIA, but I mean, he was an archaeologist, and that is in the public record. But lots of interests in this stuff. Lots of, remember the early stereotypes of the intelligence community was like, oh, these weirdos from Harvard and Yale, like all these rich boys doing this. Well, of course they're going to bring that with them. And that changes over time. But there's a lot of that overlap, as you all know, never minding interests in, oh, hey, wait, what about this? What about this hypnosis stuff? What about this like strange drug stuff? Can we use that for MK type stuff? But that, never minding that, it's just there's a cultural background to it.
Sure. And going back to your class, it sounds like, and one of the things I really appreciate about talking with you is you blend a lot of this stuff together that people often tend to leave out some of it by convenience, or just don't know about it, or you can't learn about everything, where you're talking here about in your class a mixture of gender education and things that were going on with gender in the mid 20th century, paranormal beliefs, that's just going to dance with religious beliefs.
Yeah.
And then, like you were saying, science is always at odds with seeming like some type of villain to the spiritual realms. And how do you navigate that, and what kinds of like built-in conflict arises from addressing all of this together?
Yeah. So, there was something I was going to say that I was just going to bounce off what you were talking about. It will come back to me. But I mean, the cultural study helps that really. Well, one thing I did want to mention is, you mentioned NICAP earlier. NICAP's one of those great examples of where they're not bringing it all together, where they're really trying to push one perspective for reasons, whether it's credibility, whether, like, oh, we're not going to be talking about like Adamski type stuff. We're not going to do that. We're all scientists here. Or whether it's because of ulterior motives, or all of that. But no, it brings in the social, it brings in the historical context, but also over the time of the course, one of the major things is getting to this stuff is a lot more connected, and it's often ignored within the paranormal realm. That is, I actually was just reading Leonard String, because I'm going to be talking about such things with my Frogman talk. Leonard Stringfield, which you all know who he is. I was reading his Situation Red UFO Siege. He's talking about this. I mean, this is a really nice slice of like 1975, 76, where he's on about how people are ignoring that, oh, they saw a Bigfoot also, or that they're not talking about this or that thing being, because they don't want to be disbelieved. Like, in other words, he sounds like a certain person. And I actually told my students, some of the ones that took the course, the ones I work closely with, and I'm like, guess the next 3 words. I have them, I'm listening to this thing, listening to Stringfield, but I also have the book. I pull it up, and it says something like the humanoid encounters. He's talking about basically like alien encounters. And he's putting abduction in there as well, but other kinds. But it's broad. I mean, remember, he's one of the ones that creates the Loveland frog, but not like as a creature loping through the forest or something. I'll talk about that in a second, because I think that might help you with what you're asking. But he's right in the 70s. No, the researcher working with humanoid cases, there's a huge amount of emotion and potential trauma and other things involved in the humanoid cases and the entity cases and all of that. And the investigator needs to be careful, because they can get dragged into it and have their own starting to be heavily emotional involvement and paranoid, perspective and all that. And then I asked my students, I also asked a friend of mine, Blake Smith from Monster Talk and in research of, what do you think the next 3 words that started the next sentence were? So investigators getting into this kind of paranoid state as and it says complex entity cases become more and more unusual. Can you guess what the next 3 words in the following sentence were after he talks about that? Any ideas?
Jack, go for it.
Complex entity cases become more and more unusual.
And they're traumatic for the witnesses, but they can drag in.
So we use hypnosis.
His next 3 words are John A. Keel. But that's what he's talking about. That's what he's talking about. But no, he's got that sort of thing also going on. But if this helps in terms of the cultural stuff, so I'm still putting together my presentation, but I'm going to be, what do you all know when I say the Loveland Frogman? What do you all know? And this is about an hour away from me. That's one reason I'm going. I'm actually a student doing some research there on ideas of cryptozoology and community. But do you all know this cryptid? You all know anything about it?
You know what? If you wouldn't mind explaining that, because honestly, I am not that familiar with it, and I'm sure there are people that are listening that might.
I do not. No.
Okay. All right. So, but do you know any of it, Erica? So Jack does not. Have you heard of it?
I have, but it's been a while.
That's okay. Yeah, that's what I'm asking. That's what I'm asking. So, if you go to that festival this coming weekend, I went to the Mothman Festival in September, if I remember right. Yeah, it shredded my knee, so I fell and like knocked a vendor's table over. Felt real bad. Just tripped.
Oh,
but yeah, no, it was very crowded. Got some nice scars there now. But you're going to see tons of fun. You're going to see tons of fun, like cryptid images of, Mothman and cute and sexy Mothman. And I've got one. I'm literally just going to go, well, this is the Frogman thing from 2 years ago.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Or this one you might love. It is a devotional? I think they're called devotional candle.
Oh, I love it.
Oh my goodness.
Y'all know who that is, of course.
Yep. Oh my gosh.
Monster. Yep. Braxton County. So you'll see tons of that stuff. Okay. And for my students, about half of them know that, oh, there's this frogman guy in Ohio, and he's got like a wizard's wand or something. And so it's one of these various local cryptids. The festival has taken off. So many of them around here. Somebody asked about Sexy Mothman. There are literally dissertations on this topic of how it has become this whole kind of Pokemon panoply of cryptids and other weird things tied into identity. And so on. If you just Google those words, be careful with it. But if you just Google cute Mothman or sexy Mothman, just go ahead and look at what the images bring up. Some of it will be a thing, but most of it's like, oh, look at this thing that can be a sticker. Look at this thing that can be a t-shirt. I'm going to see all of that this weekend. So the 11 Frogman, that's how they would know it. If you go look it up, it has a Wikipedia page about how in the 1970s, there was this cop who saw this, and you see this very fun looking, not fun looking, but what you'd expect, 4-foot tall frogman on Ohio, near the Little Miami River. The guy shoots at it, and either he gets it or it jumps into the river, and then another cop sees it. And we'll also mention that in the 1950s, people saw 3 strange creatures, and one held a wand, and it was sparking. And these are all various things. And then there was a 2016 photo, which most people think it's a hoax, with some teenagers out playing Pokemon Go, and they got a picture of it and all of this. And it'll probably mention there's a festival. That's what you get. What I'm going to talk them through this weekend is how in 1955, the same summer that you're having the same people recording things like the Kelly Hopkinsville Goblins, all the different UFO stuff that's going on, much of it through Leonard Stringfield, who is one of the top flag bearers he's the top flag bearer for basically Hangar 18. Like that's kind of more or less his baby because he lived in this area. He was a huge UFO investigator in the 1950s and 60s. Also for crashes. He is one of the ones that keeps hope alive, if you want to think of it, for UFO crashes into the 70s. We always associate with Stanton Friedman, and there's good reasons for that. But Stringfield was actually on that beat a few years before Friedman was. So he's the UFO guy. So when he hears about a story in the 1950s, as he's writing his journal Orbit, and there's like vast numbers of people reading this, and it's like, oh, there's a flap, there's a wave over Cincinnati, and it's like, oh, that's because you're there. But he records this story of a guy who sees these strange creatures allegedly in the middle of the night, like 4 feet tall. One of them has like this weird wand sparking thing, and at that point, the guy who turns out to be basically a maitre d' at a restaurant in the area, it's like, yeah, I'm out. I'm going home now, and he goes to the cops. Fast forward 20, so that's alien-ish, and it looks like this weird, like they look like these weird lopsided, like a lump on their shoulder, lopsided kind of Igor-looking creatures. Fast forward 17 years, and you get in 1972. So that's very UFO-y. It's very like, and it's in a book about humanoids. It's all this stuff. Fast forward 1972, and go ahead and just Google Loveland Frog and tell me what the first image. And if you want to share, if you can do this, share your screen. I don't know if you have to. I'll do it.
Okay.
Am I allowed to share my screen?
Yeah, absolutely.
Technologically, not like.
Yes. You.
Okay, so the next question is how? I mean, otherwise, if you know how to do it, you go ahead and do it.
So let's see. Then
don't worry about it.
Oh, there are some special pictures here. Let's see. Hang on 1 second.
But the very first one will probably be like a sketch looking thing.
Okay. Let me try to do this really quickly. This is and just keep talking while I fumble around with this. Don't mind me.
I would do it, but my connection is touch and go as it is. So I'm afraid if I do anything more than sip my beverage, I'll launch a nuclear weapon or something.
If you want to just like show again, it'll be on the wiki or the first one. It'll look like an eyewitness sketch. There's a reason I'm having it come up. But while you're doing that, so You see the second row or even the first row? You see the one that kind of looks like a hand sketch, like the third one in on the second row?
Yes.
So go ahead and pull that one up, just like, or it's the next to last in the first row, either way. Like below that, right below that. See the ones like black and white? Yeah. Does that look like anything, you know? Maybe including pose or other sorts of stuff. This is in 1972. Kind of from the side, walking away from you, arms swinging a little.
It looks, I mean, it looks like anything, like a Bigfoot or a gray or
well, but that image, the idea of like, oh, it's a loping thing, it's going through the way it's being depicted. The Patterson-Gimlin film is only a few years earlier. The notion of the idea that like, oh, there are these creatures and all stuff, like not just in the Himalayas, but much closer. Now, when people see this weird thing, now it's this kind of enchanted landscape of cryptozoology. One of the things I'm going to talk about is if you go look up the Loveland Frogman, you'll see people talk about the Shawnahook. Oh, it's in this old record. In this old record, there's a Miamia or a Twaiti. They come up with different names, or they call it Miami. Indigenous legend of a river demon in the region. Spoiler, that was written and created in 2001. And I've been able to actually show where it came from. And I'm going to talk about that. It was nothing like, it was not like Insidious. It was, I want to say they were a late teenager, like there was like a parody website that they were doing on like the Blair Witch Project. But then that got sucked into the literature, the Shawnahook. And then today it's this cryptid. So going from, this weirdness in the 1950s is UFOs, it's tied to ideas of like the national security state, to, now we have like monsters everywhere and like this sort of larger paranormal of the 1970s. And then into, but it's all got like an antiquity to it and like the cursed landscape in the 2000s to now it being, as somebody put in, like a sort of cottage industry of, cute animals and whatnot, very much from the Mothman Festival as cryptids become this kind of cultural other. I'm going to talk about that sort of stuff, but how it's not, is there a frogman? I'm going to talk about those things, but first of all, why does it become that? How is it interacting with people? How is it interacting with culture? And of course, you can do the same thing with anything involving UFOs. One of my favorites is, you all follow UFOs pretty well, to say the least. Do people generally see more than one or numerous UFOs when they report UFOs these days? I know, especially with the whole drone thing, we've started to hear about drone swarms, but that's kind of a new thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's relatively new. I think, people typically, when they have a sighting, it's been my experience that people have more than one sighting.
Mm-hmm. Not that they have more than one sighting, but like at a time. Like, I saw something in the sky. Like, did they see one thing or did they see like a whole squadron of them? Like, what's your typical kind of read, how usually that goes?
You know what? I mean, it's kind of a mixed bag. I mean, sometimes there are multiple objects. Sometimes there is one object. I mean, and then sometimes you've got a sighting and then you've got an apparition, or you've got, I mean, a Bigfoot, or, and I don't really get any frogmen.
Yeah, no, the reason I ask is think of how so many of the early UFO cases were, Kenneth Arnold sees 7 skipping objects, or is it 9? I can't remember. It's either 7 or 9. Loveland. Yeah. There's the Loveland case. Right. Yeah, there's like, it's routine to have squadrons of them in the 1950s into the early 60s, but really the 50s. And I have to think, like, again, this is not do people see something or not, but it's like, That's how military planes worked back then. And I'm not saying they're seeing military planes, but that's like the concept of like aviation is, oh, it's a squadron. Well, with the jet engine, that changes. And then it's like, you generally think of them as individual things. And so, yes, I think I've heard of people saying they see multiple black triangles, but it's usually one. If you think about, you don't see a fleet except for like over the Rose Bowl or something, maybe, of B2s. It's like one, and even if there are several, they're not going to be flying in tight formation. So the fact that even at that level, there's a kind of cultural loading to it.
Interesting.
I think is really interesting. Yeah. And that's what I'm kind of getting at with how this thing continues to be seen in different ways through different times. That the fact that ghost evidence has changed based on not just technology, but on expectations. The notion of EVPs only starts to emerge at a certain time, whereas previously it would be more direct contact through knockings or through mediums. But then it becomes a thing that you almost capture by accident. And it ties into, it's all magnetic. It's all electromagnetic fields. Well, the stone tape theory literally makes sense only if you have magnetic tape. That there were versions of that notion, but it changes. And so, yeah, that's kind of somewhat I'm getting at also, is how it fits with the culture. I mean, you all are aware of the idea that UFOs, when they're reported, routinely look just like the technology that's about to happen.
Mm-hmm.
That long history. Even if you want to rope in the airships, which there's a debate on whether that's a thing, and I think you can, the mystery Zeppelins, the ghost rockets, then the discs, then the black triangles, and now the drones, they're always that just, here's where we are, it's right here. It's just a little beyond in terms of how we can think of things and how we can categorize them.
And so what do you, sorry, Jack, but, what do you think? Because, you've got people like Jacques Vallée who talks about mimicry and how, they're presenting, something that's just one step above and beyond what we know, even though when we look back at things, we've been testing this technology. And so it really isn't. I mean, how much do you think mimicry is that a thing? Or is it simply because people are identifying things that are being tested that are ours that we...
I don't think most of it. I mean, obviously some is. Obviously, we know that there's some correlation with the early U-2 flights and some UFO cases. We know that's a thing. Obviously, there's some others, but I do think it is more broadly, whether you want to say it's cultural or whether you're more like, it's psychosocial, but that includes like a psychic component, which is where Vallée, I think, would, with the exception of that one book, the Trinity or whatever it is, where it's like, oh no, it's actually it's a spacecraft or whatever craft. It's like, that was so weird for him. And I don't really want to get fully into that. But barring that, the idea of it being in relation to our expectations. I don't have them read Passport to Magonia, but I talk about it quite a bit. And one of my, slides of I'm going to hurt you again, when we start talking about something and then it starts to get weird in a particular way, I keep showing the same slide. And you've all seen it, of it's a black and white woodcut with some fairies around a toadstool. And and it's a mound. It's not a hill. It's a mound with a door in it. And it's the one that always gets used when people talk about them, but especially if they're like, oh, these kind of look like, flying saucers and stuff like that. Because I keep bringing it up. No, I think the mimicry thing, whether you think it's how we engage purely psychologically or how we engage with something more esoteric, I think it's something more in that realm. I don't buy predominantly everything people see in the sky is some just over the horizon black technology thing. That does happen, of course. But I don't think that's the answer for most of it. No.
And so when we're considering, now that you mention it, and I'm thinking about it, back in the mid 20th century, there's the famous photos that the UFOs are just like these oval-shaped glowing lights, and there'll be 3 of them. or there'll be more than one, more than two. And I remember even as a kid in the 70s, they'd tell us UFOs are often mistaken. We actually are seeing birds migrating and the city
Which
lights.
Leveland has often suggested that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, so what I'm hearing, you're kind of saying that like in Stringfield's day, it's they are here, there's them, like Pearl Harbor kind of mentality, as compared to if something was coming now, I'd expect it more to be a single missile. It's kind of playing in the consciousness.
Right. And I think the fact that we now know about, we not only know about, but I mean, we're seeing them on the battlefield in places like Ukraine, and we know we're doing this, that you do have drone swarms like that. That is the upcoming technology. I just was listening to something about the whole drone craze in, New Jersey, et cetera, and New England in late last year, which all then kind of just went away. And I thought of it when you said Pearl Harbor. So when we think of it, I'm like, in fact, people started to ask me about it when it started to make news. I mean, it was a heavy UFO Twitter and Facebook type thing, but it did leak into more organized information. And so I would start fielding questions from folks I knew. And when I knew, like, oh, my family, I'm like, okay, I'm going to email you a thing. And I'd email them the wiki for the Battle of Los Angeles, the 1942 thing where like it was a war scare with all the, you all know that case, or that phenomenon, the Battle of Los Angeles thing. And I'm like, think of the Battle of Los Angeles, except that there's a whole bunch of people that can make money by talking about it online. Like, people are having this thing that sounds a lot like people are seeing stuff, but I mean, how many of them were clearly, obviously planes? Like, we've all saw photos, we all saw video, and it's like, no, you don't even have to be an AV. Yes, no, they're absolutely mimicking the FAA lights. Absolutely, that's what the aliens are doing. But add in a look at this thing, oh my God, this video, this photo. I think that's basically what that was. And so, yeah, the fact that it mirrors the technology, I think, makes a lot of sense. Whether, again, it's the phenomena, you hear people like Greg Bishop talk about the co-creation hypothesis that you have, and Vallée has kind of talked about this too, the psychosocial, where if there is a phenomenon, you're going to be engaging with it, and vice versa. So you'd have people like or Richard. Is it Richard? It is Richard. No, is it Richard Hansen? Is that his first name? Paranormal and the Trickster.
George.
Yep.
Yeah, very much plays with that same George P. Hansen.
George. Oh yes. Yep. Sorry.
Richard Hansen is my archaeologist. Works on the pre-classic. George P. Hansen. He would argue that, there is a phenomenon. In fact, a lot of his stuff ends up reading like very similar to what I know of anthropological ideas of the other. And then it's like here's why it's real. Like his book is really interesting in a number of ways, but it's a friend of mine was reading, it's like, all these ideas. I'm like, yeah, that's Turner. That's him talking about Victor Turner, except Victor Turner did kind of say it's real. But that's a digression. But no, I think there's a strong cultural component to all of it. The height of cryptozoology, it's no accident it's at the tail end of empire. That's all of these folks who were doing it in the Himalayas and elsewhere in the 1950s and 60s, looking for dinosaurs in the Congo or Himalayas and all that. That's where it starts. These are all the places that had just or were about to become independent, in the decolonization after World War II. Now, that's not what cryptozoology it means. And also, most people don't use that term. I don't think most people who are like, I'm going squatching this weekend, are necessarily thinking of it that way. It's much more like something like ghost hunting, which is also not, when I think of parapsychology, there's not much of it, but what it is, I think of like Dean Radin. I think of like the Stargate folks who are doing this experiment and that's not going and hearing what was that on your EVP in like an abandoned warehouse this weekend. And that's not a judgment. It's just that they're different things. And that's cultural. That gets into like, what's the role of the investigator? What's the role of science in the society and all
That's so
When you
fascinating.
mention the ways that people are kind of seeing what they want and calling it, they're looking at planes and then calling it what they want in at least some instances, if not a majority. That does remind me, and how Erica asked about mimicking, that I always respected valet to a certain extent, but the more I've thought about how he and some others just kind of seem to be able to use those ideas to just fit pegs where they want to keep holding their ideas up, where if it's just not falsifiable, then what are we even talking about? You know,
No, I know. I absolutely know what you're saying. Now, in terms of like quality stuff, um, and I know he's really trying to move into other stuff now. But Jason Colavito, who used to be, he didn't do the UFO stuff, but then he did. Used to be all like looking at the ancient aliens, people, and all. He took Valet to task with his. He wrote I think 2 books, but one with the author's name is Aubeck, and I think it's Wonders in the Sky. And he went through and looked at some of those cases, and he's like, I don't know if I would agree with this in terms of their treatment of it. Not like, oh, is it aliens, but more like, well, what are the historical facts of it? Not my thing. I have not read that book. I have, some of the things Valet talks about in Magonia. That's a different discussion. But I know what you're getting at, because then it starts to get into the pattern seeking thing. And especially with some of the Forteans, and we've met in Keel, Sanderson, Valet, and then you get into some people that follow in those footsteps. We mentioned Coleman and whatnot. That gets us into folks that are like, falsifiability isn't necessarily the way to go. I mean, I don't know if you've talked to him, but I'm gonna bet you're aware of Jeffrey Kripal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What would you say? I mentioned Kripal. Who are we talking about, or what do you think? Or have you talked to him?
I have not talked to him. I'm
Yeah, but
Facebook friends with him, and I definitely he's a very interesting fellow, and I would enjoy the chance to talk to him, actually.
Mm-hmm.
But he does a lot at Soul Found, doesn't he? At the conferences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jack, but before I go, and before I go, did you have anything else on Kripal? Because I'm going to talk about
I was going to say that while admittedly not reading his work, I'm not impressed with some of his associations with people that promote him and that he seems to prop up. I'm aware of some people I respect that like his work, but again, having admittedly not read his work, that's the reason I haven't read it, is I don't expect to find it worth my attention, frankly.
So, I mean, I don't know him. I know people that have very much have worked with him. He is a professor of religion, of comparative religion. So not theology, but the study of religion. Often there's more than a bit of overlap with things like anthropology and sociology with this field, but they're not the same thing. They have different sort of perspectives and training at Rice University. And his big thing is he has the archives of the impossibles. He's got Valet's papers. He's got Strieber's papers. He's co-authored with Strieber. And he has a background in the numinous, in the interaction of some things we call paranormal, some esoteric. And he's been in the last number of years picking up this topic. He's the one that, if I remember correctly, and I have read both of her books on this. I've read some of Kripal's books. I haven't read them all. He's written quite a few. I am pretty sure Pasulka says he encouraged her to do that work. Like he encouraged her to be known to anybody in this talk. Like I certainly wouldn't have heard of Diana Pasulka from her study on Catholic saints, because I don't study that, but bringing her into American Cosmic. But his thing is, and he and others have written about it this way, but he has, for example, in the book he writes with Strieber which I am blanking on its name, but if you want to look it up while I'm mentioning it, oh, it's Supernatural. That's what it is. It's super space
Yeah.
natural. Yeah. And then he's written Super Humanities, and I haven't read that one. I have it somewhere. In fact, I'm probably right in front of me actually, but I haven't read it yet. But he talks about basically his whole thing. He says this idea of the flip. He loves this idea of flipping perspectives. And so he talks about, there's the three, was it Clark's, third law, whatever it is, any technology that is sufficiently advanced can't be distinguished from magic. And he's like, no, the other way. Any magic which is sufficiently like complicated or whatever can't be distinguished from technology. And he actually goes and takes cases like the Arnold one and like works them through this, and it actually makes some sense. But he would argue that, or they would argue something akin to, and I don't want to be exactly putting words in the mouth, but I don't think I am, that somebody like Newton in that period would be a better fit, where yes, you have material science within a larger framework of knowing. At that point, the kind of falsifiability that you're talking about, especially like a sort of strict Popperian hypothetico-deductive falsifiability, that's not the same thing. That's not the same thing. And I would agree. Many of the voices for that kind of unified field theory thing often are, no, we at some point have to not, this is not a thing that's going to happen in the lab. And if it is, it's going to be not what you expect, and that gets us into remote viewing stuff and, moving X number of ball bearings in like a pinball style machine for psychic testing and such. But no, that kind of pattern finding, that if uncontrolled is apophenia. And one could argue if you control it and you do falsify it, it's called science and scholarship. But no, I could absolutely see that those are, if you're like, I want this to be falsifiable, I want an animal in a cage from biological rules, or I want this, a piece of a UFO, that's going to start potentially not being compatible.
And that's
where I begin to have a problem with it. Is it seems pretty clear to me that we're not all using the same standards of evidence. Like Diana Walsh Pasulka, for instance, Dr. Pasulka, it does not seem important from my perspective. Some of these people do not seem to be valuing the scientific standards of evidence. Dr. Gary Nolan. And the problem I have with that is that they present their work under the implication of scholarship, and that their credentials should speak for the validity of the work up until they're called on it. Then I've seen some of these people suggest, well, I'm just saying, I'm just proposing, I'm just studying culture, I'm not actually doing scientific work. And the problem I have with that is they'll let it slide as long as I'm willing to lap it up from my point of view.
That's a good point.
So I think there's two ways to look at that. Not two ways, two different kinds of that. You mentioned Pasulka. So she's a religious studies person as well. You can entirely do that as a study of people and religion, and also ideas of the beyond human, and not ever touch, and I don't mean this in a negative way at all, ever touch ideas of science and falsifiability if that's not what you're doing. You do not have to either believe the things that the people you're working with, in fact, you may not at all, that you're working with, but that you're studying sociologically or ethnographically, or from text and stuff. And even if you do have thoughts on it, you do not, you can easily do a book. You can easily do American Cosmic with no judgment whatsoever on, but do I think UFOs are this, or that they're this, or that they're this? You could also do it and this is kind of getting to your point, but then the other one we're going to get to, and I obviously want to be careful with Nolan, is I think something different. But you could also do, and I think this is closer to what it is, all of what she just said. And I'm like, no, I am just studying these people. I am just studying that. Also, I'm really good friends with them, and I'm also promoting that they're hyper smart, and maybe the government should work with them. And I think her analysis in the first book, The American, I have read both. I'm just going to say that. But I think her analysis in the first book of American Cosmic about the relationship of media and technology in some of this. But her big argument is there is a religion forming around UFOs. And you're like, well, of course, there's always been interest in it from like religion. No. A religion. And I see a question about this, and I think we can take it a bit. A religion, like an actual group. And I'm like, yeah, they're all the people you hang out with. They are valet. They are this group. They are Nolan. They are these other folks. And that doesn't mean that invalidates her work, but it does start to have you be, well, okay, what is your perspective here? What is your perspective here? And as long as that becomes kind of clear, I hesitate to say doesn't bother me, but I think you get kind of what I'm saying with that. And then you get to something you mentioned, Nolan. And obviously he does real biological work of various kinds. And if he has thoughts about, if he's got thoughts about like alien abduction and this and that, but it's not related to his scientific work, that's not unusual. That starts to get in some weird territory in terms of like, well, look, I'm a really well-accomplished scientist, so you should believe me about this thing involving abduction. And I think you're talking about that to some degree. Where I start to get into concerns is where those get closer, and I'm trying to be real careful here, but I'm thinking of the Atacama situation. You all know about that, the Atacama. So what do you all know about that?
There was valid criticism leveled and
what's
organized
the case? So what's the case? Like, what's the thing? What's the thing we're talking about? Like, for the audience.
The Atacama humanoid was what was probably a human fetus that Greer came up with, and how it was taken from Chile is extremely questionable. And then we get into more questionable areas of ethics that Dr. Nolan decided he could work on it and apply his ideas to it, and actually had some decent critical analysis of it, but that's completely beside the point.
Well, but it's not actually.
Somewhat, but it's beside the ethical point of if he should have ever been working on it in the first place.
Right.
Given that he did it, given its lack of chain of custody and all of that.
Yeah. So there's a lack. So we're talking about from the Atacama Desert, Chile, one of the driest places in the world, that there's this mummified fetus. I mean, that's what it is. And I don't think anybody actually disagrees with that per se. But yes, people like Greer and whatnot got really excited because, it looks like an alien. And of course, where is it from? Is it from Minnesota? Is it from France? No, it's from the Andes area of South. I mean, not exactly the mountains, but that larger cultural area, which has become something I presented last year at a talk at the Anthropology department at Yale. And I do want to publish this. I did a full content analysis of every episode of Ancient Aliens, as in I read the transcripts of all of them. Wow. And I have a gigantic like spreadsheet of in each episode, do they talk about this? Do they talk about this? And so I did a quantitative analysis, and South America sticks out. Not just that they cover it, they don't cover it more than some places. They actually cover places like Europe and the Middle East more. This idea, it's more complicated than, there's buildings people that weren't white people built, therefore aliens. It's actually, no, it's a lot more complex. But South America kind of sticks out. And it's had this notion of like, oh, Nazca and this and that. Hence why we get those Nazca mummies, the ones that keep getting modified and covered in that gray plaster crap and all of that. So you get this little fetus, and Greer's like, oh, it's an alien hybrid, right? And so then you mentioned that he had some critical study Nolan did. And what did Nolan, I mean, not specifics, but what's the general vibe that Nolan, we'll get back to the ethical bit in a second. But what's the general thing Nolan said it, like, what did he come up with? And he's like, look, I'm more skeptical.
My takeaway on it was that Nolan was willing to be in Greer's film and crowdsource film and run tests on it, decided it was not an alien, but for a while thought that it might have some type of yet to be better understood deformity, and that it was not a fetus, yada, yada, yada. Then turns out it wasn't that either. And by that point, South American scientists are asking, how did this ever even go this far, before an IRB or other qualified people asked, what the hell are you guys doing?
Exactly. So he puts out a paper. It puts out a paper in a peer-reviewed journal of like, no, it's not an alien, but it has all of these deformities, all these mutations, because there's copper in the area and all that. And then, and then there are South American scientists, and look, and he does all kinds of genetics works and microbiology. I'm not exactly 100% certain, but I'm pretty sure, given that he's looking for the paranormal gene, as he puts it. But then other people who study, forensics and study anthropology are like, no, the things you're talking about, we can explain just by what happens with bodies and by development. Like, in other words, if you know genetic stuff, but also if you know osteology, no, I know what that is. That there's nothing weird. There's not even never mind alien. And so it got critiqued on that level. And that's when the ethical stuff came in. And I do remember he did, if I remember correctly, and I don't want to say it was IRB or some other step in the process, but it's some step in the process. There was why were you working on it, or why were you moving it if it's human remains? And the answer was, it wasn't certain at the time that it was. And I'm like, really? Are you sure about that? And so that's where where you're talking about like this, I'm just asking questions or sliding between. That's when I start to get kind of, that is where I get annoyed. And with the ethics and also the sort of intellectual aspects. I mean, the way I often like to sort of paraphrase this or give kind of like a quick soundbite for it is, look, you tell me about paranormal Bigfoot. You tell me, like, I have less problem with paranormal Bigfoot, with paranormal portal Bigfoot, because I don't know how portals work, because also whether they exist is a different discussion. But, I don't know how that works. But flesh and blood biological, ape man, then I kind of do know how that works, and it should have this, and it should have this, and it has this problem and this problem. And that's where it does start to get into, okay, if you're actually saying you're doing physical science on this, then do physical science, and don't tell me you are, but then ignore all the problems. Now, you said, maybe at some point they're like, well, maybe it doesn't work that way. And that's, I've heard people say, they embrace the sort of paranormal. And again, I'm just using Bigfoot like as a thing. Okay, you can put UFO, whatever. It's paranormal Bigfoot because we can't find it. So it's like a dodge. I think it's the other way. The thing that comes up again and again and again is doing that. You're like, they're not going to follow the rules anymore. They want to, but once they can't, they go elsewhere. I think that's the whole point. I think the whole point is to overturn the rules. The whole idea of, we want to find life after, we want to find psychic powers. Why? Because that's tied to consciousness beyond the body. Okay, why? Because that means that we live after death. Like, it is literally flipping it, like Kripal talks about. I do a show again with Blake Smith of Monster Talk, a podcast. I'm not like just randomly blurbing here. There's a reason I say this. Called In Research Of. And we are watching You know, Gen Xers all know what this is. Obviously, we're watching the Leonard Nimoy In Search Of, episode by episode. We are over 2/3 through. We just did the UFO cover-up episode, the first time Roswell was ever a thing in a paranormal show ever, in 1980. We just did that. And it was fascinating to watch. They didn't have Stringfield. They had Ray Fowler. And they had Jesse Marcel. They did not have Stan Friedman. We were debating who we thought was going to show up, but it was, and they went to Dayton because they kind of did the Hangar 18 thing. But no, it is Roswell, and they reenact not the crash, but they have a field in the desert, and it's like, it looks like aluminum siding or something that they've thrown in the air. And then my favorite hero of it is there's just this little turtle going through the field as the stuff falls. I mean, that turtle is the true hero of this. And they have a guy with like a secret can that he's putting the stuff in. So it's the first UFO thing. But we watched that show. The very first episode of In Search Of. Now, before that, there were like specials about Bigfoot and the ancient aliens. But when the show goes, is talking to plants. It's called Other Voices. And you're like, what? What? Why is it that? Until you dig into who everybody on the show is, and they're all into parapsychology. They're all significant voices in parapsychology. And that's like, well, why do you care if like plants can psychically feel what you feel? Well, because psychic things are real, and therefore materialism is wrong. And, you know, it has been argued. I don't know how much I 100% agree with this, but that things like cryptozoology are kind of a reaction to the fact that extinction emerges. You know, again, the idea that like whole swaths of things died, and that's we're going to as well, which is terrifying. You know, I argue in classes, humanity finally starts to realize its own mortality in the 19th century, because it's like, oh wait, species can die. Oh no. The cryptozoology is kind of a reaction, because again, if you think about it, most of your early cryptids, before they're called that, are usually supposed to be survivals from the past. You know, they're not magical dragons. Like, oh no, they're dinosaurs. Oh, they're not, you know, trolls. They're, oh no, they're cavemen. They're, you know, that starts to be the appeal as a reaction to what science is finding. And by the way, Vancouver guy, you mentioned the National Enquirer coverage of Roswell. Yes. Also, there was some coverage of Jesse Marcel in Houma, Louisiana, like locally, but as like a full-on paranormal television show. This is the first Roswell one, this episode from 1980. But there were things in media before that, yes.
And let me just go back really quickly to Atacama, sorry, because I wanted to address that and the unethical aspects about that. And I wanted to ask you, Jeb, if you know, did Gary Nolan ever address the fact that there was this human remains that were taken out of a country, which to my knowledge is illegal, and then sold again? I mean, did any of these people that were looking at it or studying that ever address those ethical issues, or I mean, potentially issues that are breaking laws?
So in terms of any of the sold, I don't know if he's ever spoken to that. I don't know. And again, I would want to be careful, because I would want to not, like, without the text in front of me, but I'm pretty sure. So this is a pretty sure that he has addressed when it was discussed, like, well, these are pretty clearly human remains, and then therefore there were these ethical issues. Again, if I'm wrong on this, so I want to be very clear, but I'm pretty sure there was well, they were not considered necessarily to be human remains when the project was starting. Therefore, it's not where we are now, that we're definitely human remains, that was the argument.
Okay.
I would be curious about the IRB that promoted that, never minding. And then you're asking about international trafficking laws, and that's a whole other discussion. And that becomes a whole thing. And by the way, they weren't ancient. I mean, it was pretty clear we think they're from the 1960s or even later, which also brings up the fact that, like, it's one thing to have a descendant community. We're talking like you could have members of a nuclear family still alive from that. Right. So that's a whole other discussion. And it's mentioned in the And when we do get an ancient, it's mentioned in the comments about the Nazca mummies and all of that, that there's an entire industry using like actual ancient human remains there. This gets into some really interesting territory. There was, at least at the start, a UFO group or a UFO related, but also Christian group in Peru called the Alpha E Omega, that like was involved with some of the earliest claims of this. I think it has, ever since Jaime Maussan and others got involved, changed. But early on, it was, and it still was, like, oh, are they alien or not? Eventually, Peruvian officials of, antiquities got involved because it does start to get into legal stuff. But as I know you both know, and Jack, you've written about this, I think there's an element that almost kind of stops punishment to some degree if the topic is weird, or if the topic's being framed as weird. And the obvious one, I think you both know where I'm going. Speaking of IRB, speaking of ethics, is Dr. David Jacobs, who I know you've all talked about quite a bit, where if you were doing, I cannot predict because I don't have a multiple universes predictor thing. But if you were having a history professor doing study on, I don't even know what, but not aliens, by hypnotizing people and all the stuff that came with, that was the alien stuff, would their IRB have said, oh, he's just collecting oral history?
Mm-hmm.
What they did do. Again, Jack, you've written about this. You both know the case. But the fact that it involved alien abduction, I think somebody at some point were like, oh, just make this shit go away, please. Because I don't want to deal with the alien thing. And whereas if it wasn't that, it might have been more concerning to some people earlier in the process.
And that's a great point. And Jack and I had a conversation. Was it yesterday, Jack? I don't know. Things blur. But about the fact that because this subject or conspiracy, the matter can be so, I mean, people look at it and just go, are you kidding me? This is ridiculous. And so people aren't engaging in that, but they're also, it's a great cover for more nefarious goings on, whether you're grifting or whether there's an intelligence aspect to things. I mean, I've mentioned on the show more than once, Jack and I both talked about it, about a conference over in Russia that was sponsored by the Russian and Chinese, and here you have a figurehead who is very well known in each like 7 continents, that they're flying over to Russia, under the guise, I would imagine, I mean, there's a lot to be looked into on this, but kind of under the guise that this is a UFO, quote unquote, topic where they're addressing things. I mean, the whole thing is fascinating. And so I think people need to understand that because this subject is so ridiculous, that doesn't mean that there aren't things going on that need to be looked at.
So I don't know this case, and if you don't want to name names, it's okay, but I don't know this particular case. Who are we talking about, if we can, or if you don't want to go, that's fine.
No, so it was John Schmidt, Gary Hesseltine, I think the fellow from, is it Brazil, AJ Javard, I'm pretty sure was there. Yeah. I could try to find the cover.
Yeah, China and Russia collaborated on a conference and flew ufologists in, and in fact, we don't often take it this far, but I'll go ahead and say this. You talking about, oh, just make it go away. I've become pretty confident, even in the intelligence community, there's special agents and officers that don't want to be the go-to guy for see what they're doing at this UFO conference. Like I didn't go to college and get recruited into the bureau to chase ufologists around. Like I think it would work that way too.
I hesitate to put it this way, but I show pictures of sometimes, like when I'm talking about Blue Book, I'll pull up pictures and it's Hector Quintanilla, and there's another one, and there's one I pulled up of him, first of all, which is hilarious because there's a picture of them there. in like their Dayton office, and I have a couple of them. And one of them, there's like a little ashtray or something on the desk. I'm like, hey kids, what is that? And I zoom in on it in the next slide, and it's like a little fairy elf thing. I'm like, there they are. But yeah, the fact that like, oh, what did I do wrong? Why am I on the UFO desk? You know, and I'm not going to be trying to turn it into a whole spin career, like someone who says that they're the UFO molder of a different country called the UK. I mean, I'm sure we don't know who we're talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, he talks about who he is. Not Dolan. So many Nicks. Pope. Yeah. Did we talk about? I don't want to get into it here, but did we talk about his wife?
We certainly could, in
Let's
conjunction with.
Well,
Attaboy.
I don't know how far I want to get into it, but his wife has become controversial in anthropology over issues of human remains and other kinds of topics, and it's become political and all of this. But she got really into she co-wrote a book. Hang on, since we're talking about it, I don't want to get too deep into it, but hang on. Sorry about the typing sound.
It warrants mention. It does.
Elizabeth Weiss, Weiss. Okay, and she was she was a professor. I think she's left the university where she was at. Hang on, I got to get back to the window. There we are. And are about biological anthropology, archaeology, studying human remains. And she got into controversy with the Society for American Archaeology at like a talk where people didn't like this. She was basically giving a talk about how indigenous, and she wrote a whole book about this, co-wrote one with a lawyer. It's partly why I'm being very careful here. But about how things like NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, were an infringement of First Amendment rights to do things like science. You know, why do you have indigenous religious leaders in reburial ceremonies that are being guided by that federal law? And she gets into much more and critiques indigenous knowledge in her book. I mean, this is in the blurb. I'm not like being interpretive here. But yeah, that's Nick Pope's wife. They got married at a UFO conference in Nevada. And if you Google her name, that's actually the first photo.
Yeah, she is very controversial.
Yeah. And on his Twitter, Pope talks about how he's always said he's the UK molder. And he's like, how weird is it that like I married a scientific redhead skeptic? And I'm like, I'm not saying whether your life is good or bad, but putting it that way is kind of cringe. Just going to put that out there.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, no, and
I agree.
That's just me, really, like, really. But yeah, no, that's a case of, I forgot how. Oh, we got there because of who these people are and who they're working with, and so on. But yeah, no, I want to look more into this China summit thing. I was not, and Don Schmidt. If somebody paid Don Schmidt to go tell him about Roswell again, I mean, that's their money.
Well, also, and I'm sure you're aware of this from your studies and experience, it's a technique. Like, this isn't a conspiracy theory or speculation. It's a technique in the global intelligence community to have academic conferences in order to get some specific people at a place that your intelligence personnel can target them for recruitment or for extraction of information or whatever. So it's possible that you'd bring in a lot of UFO people while you're actually targeting someone else as well. Like, there's a lot of possibilities here that the UFO conference could kind of be the distraction while you're just trying to get at a couple of key people that have expertise in an area that you're actually interested in talking to them about.
Oh yeah, it absolutely can. And David Price, he's written heavily. He's an anthropologist, and he's written, I want to say, 3 books now on the interaction of anthropology and the intelligence community. And one of them is about anthropologists as spies. So I pull a bunch from that when I'm doing my writing and work. But a lot of it is about intelligence in the universities and intelligence at conferences, including, and this is especially in the 60s through 80s, keeping tabs as activists. So there's the like, oh, we hire them or we want intel, but there's also the like, oh, FBI and CIA keeping files on me, that sort of thing on the other side. And no, those conferences, I'm sure they still are, but they certainly were a huge site for that sort of behavior. And of course, and this gets outside of this general realm, but I mean, we're all aware that they're like, oh, these people here had in a certain Eurasian capital a thing on the 4th of July, and oh, look who's here, and these politicians and all that. And then all of a sudden they're kind of sympathetic to those people's aims in wars and whatnot. But not naming any particular names. But no, absolutely. And again, that is an old relationship. That's an old relationship of intelligence and academia. And it's not surprising. I mean, so much, people are like, oh, intelligence is either just eavesdropping or it's getting secret files or, whatever pop culture version up to and including like, stopping laser weapons on the moon in a tuxedo. But a lot of it's analysis. I mean, the reason why so many of the early archaeologists were spies as well is like, okay, well, they travel here. They know these languages. They pick up clues. They're supposed to be doing stuff with cameras and equipment. I mean, they're often in a very similar business. One of my friends from grad school went CIA for a while. Others went, I don't know if they still have their jobs in the last week, State Department. So and that's not intelligence world, but it's part of the larger foreign service. And well, gonna leave all that discussion alone. But no, absolutely, there can be very human reasons for these interactions, no question.
Something else I wanted to touch on. Something else I wanted to touch on, please, before we get too far from it. You aptly said a couple of minutes ago, Jeb, that we can't find Bigfoot, so he must be paranormal. That's certainly some of the mentality behind it, with we can't get these spaceships under a glass, whatever the fill in the blank may be, it must be paranormal or metaphysical. And that's the problem I have with it, that when they go to these UFO conferences and they're just gaslighting us if they try to lead us to believe this isn't some kind of pseudo-scientific forum, that they're like presenting it under the guise of my colleagues and fellow scholars and all of this kind of stuff. Like they can say in the foreword of their book that they're not promoting anything and they're just doing collecting oral histories or doing cultural work, whatever the case may be. But we sit here and we watch them go to these conferences, do these interviews, and frame this as if they're presenting it scientifically. And that's the problem that I have, that after decades, when you have no conclusive proof of something, I'm not saying there's not evidence, but sober minds would agree there's no conclusive proof. Then the going hypothesis has to be that your hypothesis is wrong. I mean, that has to be the high hand to beat, instead of flipping it to it's magic. And thank you for letting me get that out. Just
Yeah.
that's my problem with it.
So, I mean, I think there is some where it's flipped tactically. I do think there's some where it's like, okay, we can't find it, therefore. I think some of it, and it's going to sound weird, I think some of it is like Stan Gordon. We all know who he is, right? Pennsylvania, big. I find that a very honest approach in some ways, in the sense of like, yeah, no, a guy in the early 70s said they saw like a werewolf that looked like the movies. And he puts that in too. He's not like, well, because the question would be, well, how is this different than the lights in the sky? It's like, well, this one works better if you're in nightcap. It's like, yeah, but the guy said it too. So just put that out there. And, you could argue Keel's doing that. That gets a little more complicated. But I do think some of it is in some ways almost more honest. Like, if you're doing abduction stuff, but you don't mention that some people talk about it as demonic, and you don't mention that some people have this, and you don't mention, well, then you're just turning it into your biological thing. So in some ways I see it's magic, as you put it, being more honest, but then are you doing mainstream science? And then so that becomes that issue. I gotta say, with the going to, as someone who's giving a talk at the Loveland Frogman Festival, I'm very happy to this weekend. One of my students is doing some research there, and I showed earlier this week. There's a old like 2005 or 7, one of the earliest like web animation comics. It was a Homestar Runner. It had Strong Bad and all this early internet, not early, but for them it's before they're alive. Internet culture, and it's one about going to a comic book convention, and so they're at this booth, and the guys watching all the things that are going by. It's like, oh, ironic comic book costume man. Look at you. You're also here at the comic book convention. It's like, if you're at the UFO convention, so I'm going to be giving a talk at a Frogman thing, and I'm cool with that, and I know what I'm doing with it. But you're right. At some point, we're not talking about the same sort of thing. And that, of course, is why it is. And here, I do think this is highly tactical. And here, I don't really feel as charitable. If you can get the confirmation, or if you can get the supporting fire, if you can get the backing of saying, well, yeah, but you know what? The people I'm talking to, you do know they talk to Congress, right? You do know that they'll tell you stuff in a skiff that somebody else told them, right? And so, yeah. Oh, wow.
Really quickly, I just found that, so I just wanted to pull that up, and I hate to interrupt you.
Hang on a second. Hang on. I want to see this. All right.
5 continents. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm trying to see who all the folks there are. Wow. That is, I'm going to have to look this up. The 2018, I got to look for this. And then, yeah, I saw a stand, and I'm like, oh, he can't be at this thing. But yeah, no, that's interesting.
We're not talking about 50 years ago.
Yeah, well, no, I didn't think so. I just was wondering if it was like in the last 6 months, or no, I was not aware of this.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry for letting me interrupt you there.
No worries. But yeah, no, it starts to get into it. What is it that you're dealing with here? And I don't mean phenomena wise, but you mentioned the magic thing, and you're like, oh, falsifying hypothesis. And sometimes I have been, and right now I'm not really in this mentality to hit this note too hard, but I've at times been, when people are talking about like, oh, okay, it's not UFO aliens, it's something more nebulous. And then eventually some people will get to the, oh, it's a co-creation of your mentality, and it's in our brains, and the reality, it's how our brains react with reality. And some of my more cynical moments, I go, oh my God, you're so close. We call it culture. And that's not necessarily the best way to look at it, but I get what you're saying. I have been there at times.
Well, I am not as materialistic as I might sound in this conversation. Like what you were just talking about just then are the types of things I would expect to experience, for instance, on a Buddhist meditation retreat or something like that.
Which is the kind of world that I comes out of, yeah.
Yeah, the problem I have is someone that it feels like outright gaslighting, to be honest, tells me they are just exploring this culturally and they have no dog in the hunt, but they're obviously close with this person and promoting their story. Um,
Well, it should be that
of
they're open. It should be that they're like, no, I got a dog in this hunt because there is activist social science. There is activist anthropology. I don't mean, oh, it all is, but like, no, I'm working with activists. I'm trying to change this particular thing. I'm working with this. I do have reasons I'm doing this, and I'm open about it. You can do that, but it can't necessarily be, oh my God, look, I discovered these people and I hadn't heard of them. How'd you find out about them? Well, with this person I'm constantly working with who's also one of the people. I mean, that's the issue. Is it's not, oh, you can't objective, I must not, I have to be objectively distant from. Saying, no, you don't have to be, just be open about it. We just had somebody here that was talking about anthropology and using that to study the flow of guns from the US into Mexico, and then violence and all these different things. And she is clearly related to various concerns and issues there. That's okay if it's open. That becomes the broader issue, is if it's a stealth project. And I don't mean like at a Groom Lake, but if it's a stealth project for something else. I want to talk about unidentified aerial potential threats. Oh, you mean like drones? Yeah, like drones and other things. What do you mean other things? Well, other things, but can we get the money to do it? Okay, yeah. What are the other things? Well, they're orbs. Okay, are they drone orbs? Well, maybe. We'd have to ask the people on the other side of the portal. The what now?
yeah.
I mean, that's and then when that gets too far. So, but do remember, we did talk about drones. We're still back there. But no, that kind of game. The thing of like people like Mellon, that I agree. It's like, just be honest with what you're doing, or be more open with what you're doing.
Well, when you mentioned the Atacama, and the argument was, well, at this point, I hadn't yet identified this as humanoid. I mean, that just you know what comes to mind with that for me is the Roswell slides. Like, well, what the hell else would it be? I mean, maybe my cat's a dog. I haven't actually had it checked by a scientist,
And if since it's been, more than half an hour, I don't mean this, I mean, since the Roswell slides, and therefore it's already forgotten in UFO Twitter, that was this notion that photographs had been found and they were pushed by the same guy involved in the Nazca mummies, Jaime Maussan, where they're like, hey, let's have a thing in Mexico City on Cinco de Mayo. And they released these slides, and there was the group of people, and they had a name, like it was a mixture of skeptics and non-skeptics.
Roswell slides group.
Yes. And they broke it in 36 hours where they were able to figure out what it said. But I remember, because I was following this really closely at the time, 6 months earlier, when they put out the very first trailer for this event, and it had like a brief image, and people were like, is that a mummy? That looks like a mummy. Like well before the conference. It wasn't like, they put out some no pictures, and then the pay-per-view, and then like, oh my God, they've got a mummy. It was already, people were already kind of like just on the photo. And that was not the initial thought. Nobody thought that was going to be it when they said, oh, we got pictures of a body. They're like, oh, is it going to be another alien autopsy? Has somebody faked up a body, blah, blah, blah. And then like, that looks like a mummy in a museum case. And then of course, when they got the photo, they're like, that's a mummy in a museum case. And we de-blurred the sign. And it's like, this is this mummy dug up on this date by this guy in this site at Mesa Verde.
You know, yeah.
Nobody, just let me finish my thought. I'm sorry, I apologize.
Sorry.
You're right. Nobody looking at that photo, never mind deblurring, anything else should have been, wait, they should have all been like, isn't that a mummy in a museum? Like, it just looks like it. Yeah. Yeah. Erica, you were saying.
So I'm sure people that follow my show and have followed me over the years know that I was involved in a little bit with the Roswell slides controversy. I was MUFON executive, or excuse me, state director at the time, and I was doing my own podcast, and I was asked to conveniently host MUFON Radio because they were in cahoots with Jaime Maussan, and they wanted me to do the interview with Jaime Maussan about the Roswell slides. And so, yes, and I wish I had that. Maybe somebody's got it somewhere and they could send it to me. But I did, Jaime sent me the big packet of, all the research, quote unquote, and I spent time trying to talk to different people, especially people that were involved with the, kind of the skeptical side. And I did reach out to a couple of them. I think I only heard from one of them and had a very brief conversation. And so when I was trying to present everything on the show and do it in a way where, okay, here's what Jaime's saying, here are some skeptical thoughts on this, and it was just, while I'm representing MUFON and trying to toe the company line, whatever that means. These days, that could mean anything. But it was really interesting because, I was just nailed all over the internet by the Roswell Slides group. And I think I've still got memes of me out there. And it was just, I was simply trying to present this side of the story and then present the other side of the story, which people should be doing. And that was a really interesting thing to see, the way I was approached by Jaime, the way I was treated by the skeptical community or the belief, it was just a fascinating learning experience for me. And it also taught me that I think the people who are trying to be skeptical sometimes can also be, hide behind pseudonyms and also have questionable backgrounds, I would imagine themselves. And so the whole thing was very interesting for me.
Oh yeah, that's a whole other discussion. Some of the people in that community, which I don't at this point at all consider myself part of, not whether I think this or that should be examined this way, but there was that, even before there was Gamergate, there was Elevator Gate, and there's been, which was in that world, and all this stuff in like that kind of secular skeptical thing that we've seen everywhere. It's not just, that they're particularly susceptible, but there are skeptics I can think of where I'm like, oh no, we're not doing that. And sometimes it's because I just don't want to be associated, and sometimes it is because like, also your argument here. Yeah, no. One of the things I mentioned in that conversation article, and we had a bit of a time trying to figure out how to write it, was you gotta be, evidence is evidence is evidence. And I don't just mean, you must have evidence, but it's also, that's what it is. One of the things I tried to get past folks is, we're looking at the, we're looking at the Patterson-Gimlin film, for example. Okay. And there are people who absolutely will be like, that thing is real. I've done these studies and all of that. And you see the video and they're really into it. And then somebody else will be like, well, yeah, but Bob Hieronymus, he said all these things. He was in this thing. I'm like, yeah, that's a story. That's all that is. Just because it agrees with you thinking Bigfoot doesn't exist doesn't make it more correct. Or even something as simple as the, and in both cases, I'll give an example, the surgeon's photo, the Loch Ness photo, where there's the deathbed confession that it's a submarine. I can't tell you 100% it's a submarine, but if you look at the uncropped image, it's clearly something very small, about the size of some plaster on a submarine. So I think that's what it is. In the case of Patterson-Gimlin, it's great that Bob Hieronymus says, oh yeah, I was in that suit. And if you see him walk, it's like, yeah, that walks like Patty. But what's way better is the reality that it was, I forget his first name, but McLeod wrote a book on all of this a number of years ago, pointing out that the timeline for the Patterson-Gimlin film doesn't work. where they're like, oh, we're out here making our Bigfoot movie that we were going to get a suit for, by the way. We just weren't going to find Bigfoot. Oh, wait, we found Bigfoot. And we have a particular kind of color film that can only be processed at certain places, because this is the late 1960s. And it was on a Friday. It was the end of the week. And they were showing it to people by like a day or so later. And you would have to get to the place to process it. It would have taken longer than they could to drive there. In other words, the timeline doesn't work. That's actual evidence. But yeah, you'll see skeptical things. There's one, my friend, again, Blake, he's actually done some experimental work on the Kelly Hopkinsville goblins thing, which is a fascinating case, 1955, like basically the first little, one of the very first, again, Stringfield, one of the very first little people coming out of a UFO story, helps inspire Close Encounters, helps inspire things like that. In Kelly Hopkinsville, Kentucky, also home to Edgar Casey, interestingly. But there were skeptics who were like, oh, did they really have this gun battle? It's like, well, yeah, they had pictures of the screen doors they fired at the alleged aliens through. It's like, well, those look cut, so blah, blah, blah. It's like, so he went and got a shotgun and started firing at like screens. It's like, no, this is exactly what they would look like. And he got really angry with and he's a skeptic. He got really angry with an article about critical thinking that basically said, oh, well, they were probably drunk. It was probably like the people who saw were drunk. It's like, there's no evidence of that. And there's actually plenty of evidence that is against that. And just because it allows you to say, therefore, these things aren't aliens, doesn't mean it's right. It's still bullshit. So no, I fully agree. Again, kind of like the comic book convention thing I mentioned, you're also in the thing. Skeptics are also part of the paranormal community. Like if you're doing paranormal stuff, even if you're like, it's all bullshit, guess what? You're also at the comic book convention. I mean, that's reality. And I think a lot of people sometimes forget that as well.
One I see a lot, Jeb, is that when someone says, that was my hoax, I did this photo or I did that event, quote unquote, skeptics will accept that much less critically than the people that claim they saw it.
Yeah, exactly. And that is, and that's what I try to teach them. That's much as critical thinking as well. It's like, you got to get outside your own mind. This is what we do in anthropology. You got to get outside your own mindset one way or the other. Because I would find them like in class, some of them are like, oh, okay, well, that's obviously nonsense. And I'm like, okay, but why? Why is it? Show me why. Demonstrate it. And if you can't get rid of it necessarily without further evidence, but it doesn't mean you're supporting it. It's just don't believe something simply because it agrees with you one way or the other. I mean, look at how many different explanations there are for Roswell, for the Roswell case. Some of them just sound absolutely ridiculous to me, even though they would easily be not alien, but I don't buy it. I don't buy it, even if it's something that would agree with my larger worldview. I'm like, yeah, but that story ain't true. I don't buy that at all. And that's true of a lot of these things, where you get these false explanations that aren't even necessarily lies. They fall into this category that I cannot stand of, hey, did you know this? I haven't come up with a name of them yet, but it's these things that people think they know, and they'll talk about like at a cocktail party or whatever. The one I always love to point to is the only structure you can see from outer space is the Great Wall of China. Okay, you've all heard that idea, right? It's not only nonsense. You'll get like astronauts who are saying, well, not really. The person who said that was well before not just space flight, but flight. It was just a thing that was being said, and it becomes this factoid, or there's this idea. Scientists say that vampires, those stories could come from there's certain diseases. There's like porphyria and whatnot, or conditions, not diseases, conditions that make you iron deficient. So maybe that's why there's this idea they might need to drink blood, and it makes their skin sensitive to the sun. I'm like, dude, The whole that they disappear in the sun thing, that comes from the movie Nosferatu. That's not a thing. Yeah, he's weaker, but that's because he's a creature of darkness. These are things that don't even make sense until later versions. And they're just nonsense stories that make people feel smart.
Well, that's really valuable to me, is following the story, finding the source. My friend and friend of the show, Aaron Gallius, is a historian. He prioritizes
I listened to his
that.
show.
Yeah, Adam Gorightly has done some good work in his writing. That I don't want to hear somebody just tell me that MJ12 was likely fraudulent. Explain to me where it came from and how you know that and why. And you get that from these guys and people like you. And that's so important, because that's what takes it away from, you can see, you know, the Great Wall of China is the only thing you can see from space. That's what makes it different from that.
And it also takes it away from yelling at each other on Twitter. I mean,
come on, that's so much fun. UFO Twitter, that's my favorite.
I don't do that. I follow it. Like, you know, there's like, oh, there's so many like ridiculous and bad things on Twitter. I'm like, yeah, that's kind of why I'm there, to watch it. But no, I don't get into the like, I'm going to argue it with somebody here and there. By the way, in the comments, Rachel Nelson mentions there's one of these kind of like cocktail party ideas that Mary Anning is the origin of the she sells seashells. I had never heard that until last week, when I was talking about one of the very early fossil hunters, paleontologists, Mary Anning. She finds a lot of the earliest fossils of plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs and stuff. And one of my students like, is she the one that's like the origin of that rhyme, or what do we call it? Tongue twister? And I'm like, I have no idea if you can find something like that. So I'm really glad somebody else has actually ever heard of that. And I do suspect it might be one of those, did you know, type things. There's an opposite one.
Is Mary Anning a well-known archaeologist or anthropologist?
Mary Anning, early 19th century, when dinosaurs are being, in essence, invented. And I don't mean that they're created. I mean, one of my favorite moments of my life is I went to the Natural History Museum in London, and they have the iguanodon bones, the fossils that are the very first time some science types looked at. And I'm like, we need to come up with a name for these things that we didn't know existed. They're lizards, and they would have been huge. Let's call them terrible lizards, dinosaurs, you know. So she, even before that, is finding, they're not dinosaurs, but they're the same time period. Plesiosaurs, mosasaurs, ichthyosaurs. She is a dedicated paleontologist and fossil hunter. She's a big deal. So I have no idea if she's related to the tongue twister, but it's one of those factoid things. I think there's an opposite version of this, and this is one that I cannot stand, and that is if someone's like, well, I don't really believe in UFOs. Like, well, isn't that arrogant that with all the stars and all the universe and all the planets, are you telling me life's not out there? I'm like, no, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about that if there was an orb over Pennsylvania that disgorged either a gray alien or a Bigfoot in 1983. That's UFOs. That's not, is there life amongst the stars? But it feels like that same like, oh, look at how much wonder and things. I'm like, yeah, no, it's great you have wonder, but that has nothing to do with majestic. That has nothing to do with black triangles, or that has nothing to do with alien abduction, unless you show why it does. You know, as Valet would put it, look, these stories of fairies, they sound a lot like it. Why is it aliens? Just because you grew up after, you know, Sputnik? Is that why it's aliens now? So yeah, no, that feels like me, like the opposite version of one of those for a more kind of like paranormal type thing. But yeah, it's lazy. It's like, I didn't really think about, usually it's not somebody deep into this stuff. Usually it's somebody who's like kind of interested. And it's like, you don't really actually care that much about this either way, do you? And you get and that's the people we were talking about who are like, oh, that's getting weird. I'm just going to go back to my desk now. Like, I'll start to tell them about, like, the Mothman prophecies and explain why it's a watershed moment and how people think about this. And after about the third or fourth bit, they're like, So it's not just little gray things or just people making it up. Hey, you know what? I got a meeting now. Well, dude, it's 12:23. You have a meeting at 12:23? Yes, I gotta go. And I think it's that I don't want to get into this. I don't want to get too involved because it's not that important to me.
Speaking of Adam Gorightly, along those lines, we had an interaction one time where we were talking about, if friends or neighbors say, wow, did you hear about that Pentagon thing or something like that? And he said, even with people that have done this, like if they'll invite him to be on his show or something like that, he said he's gotten to where he'll qualify it, that like what happened at Dulcie or what's going on with Benowitz. And he's like, it's going to take me like a half hour to lay out the basics. And unless you're just crazy, you're going to wish you hadn't even asked me.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. So when I have a course that people have signed up, and it's a 60-person course, by the way, or so, and it has very much been full. We're running it again this fall, so we'll see how it goes.
I bet.
But I warn them, this is going to get really weird, and don't think it's just going to be this and that. But yeah, if you're talking to somebody for an hour, yeah, you can't do that. You can't do it that quickly. And there's a phrase I've been using these days for not just that, but stuff in the news where, like, I'll know something terrible on the news and I don't want to hurt somebody else's brain by telling them. And like, if they keep pushing on it, I'm using like well, you open the door, counselor, to basically like, okay, if you really, if you find my answers disturbing, then maybe stop asking scary questions, Pulp Fiction. No, that becomes a whole mess. And yeah, people just they don't want to know about it. If they really don't want to know about it, they're just like, okay, I know. And then you start sounding like, by the end, you start sounding like the crazy conspiracy person to explain the crazy conspiracy stuff. Like you end up in front of, as I did in the last days of the last time I ran it. Okay, so here's how Bob Bigelow knows this person who knows this. It's just like, I'm the meme. I'm the meme from every. It's Always Sunny. So yeah.
I love it.
I'm gonna have to look up this thing, the Mary Annie Metafolklore, the twist. I'm gonna look at that later. So thank you. So cool. Well,
yes,
anything else? Because I think we're getting close to the time.
No, this is wonderful. And I mean, I would love to at some point in time, maybe in another 7 months, have you back and talk to you more about, what you're doing. And then also a couple of things that you brought up in this conversation. I mean, this is very important and fascinating to me. I know it is to Jack as well. And so we appreciate you coming on the show and this great conversation.
Well, thank you so much. It's been great. And I always love talking about this stuff with knowledgeable folks, super knowledgeable folks who have been, in the community more than I have been, and all of that, and write all the things. So that's always fun. It's not like, oh, all right, I gotta tell you who Richard Shaver is now.
Right.
That's always a really good starting point. So thank you all.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a wonderful weekend. We will catch you next time.
All right. Thanks so much.
You, absolutely. And so, Jack, thanks for a wonderful night. I want to make sure that everybody can go to expandingfrontiersresearch.org to check out our blog. We rely on public support to do what we do, and we really are asking for that support. If you could donate $15 a month to help us do our FOIA requests, records requests, to help us in the archival process and things, we would appreciate it. And you can visit our Patreon page on expandingfrontiers.org. So thank thank you very much. I want to thank everybody who was here in chat tonight. You guys are rolling with the time change here, and it's wonderful to see you guys. Be very careful out there, and we appreciate you. Jack, have a wonderful weekend. I'm sure I'll talk to you. Okay.
Thank you,
Good night, you
Erica.
guys. Take care.